There is a river somewhere in northern Francia in the year 745, and a woman is kneeling at its edge in the gray light before dawn. She has a wooden bucket, darkened with age, and she fills it slowly, carefully, because the bank is slick with mud, and a fall here could mean a broken wrist or worse. The water is cold and silty. It carries the taste of earth and something faintly metallic, the residue of iron-rich soil upstream. She does not think about this. She thinks about the weight of the bucket on the walk back, the fire that needs feeding, the children who will wake hungry. This is her morning, and it has been the morning of women like her for as long as anyone in this settlement can remember. The river is not a convenience. It is the reason the settlement exists at all. If you wanted to understand why people lived where they lived in the 8th century, you would not look at borders on a map or the ambitions of kings. You would look at water. On every cluster of timber-framed houses, every monastic enclosure, every fortified hall belonging to a Frankish lord or an Anglo-Saxon thane sat where it did because of proximity to a river, a spring, or a reliable well. Water dictated the shape of the early medieval world more completely than any decree issued from a royal court. It was the single non-negotiable requirement of survival. And in an age when the elaborate hydraulic infrastructure of the Roman Empire had largely crumbled into disuse, finding it, managing it, and living alongside it defined the rhythm of daily life in ways that are almost impossible for us to fully appreciate from our world of pipes and taps and treatment plants. 3 centuries before our woman knelt at that riverbank, much of Western Europe had still benefited from the engineering legacy of Rome. Aqueducts carried clean water across dozens of miles into cities. Lead and ceramic pipes distributed it to public fountains, bathhouses, and wealthy private homes. Sewers carried waste away. The system was not perfect, and Roman cities were far from sanitary paradises. But the infrastructure represented a civilizational commitment to managing water at scale. When the Western Empire fragmented over the course of the 5th and 6th centuries, that commitment fragmented with it. Aqueducts fell into disrepair, not because anyone decided to abandon them, but because the centralized taxation, labor coordination, and engineering expertise required to maintain them no longer existed. The Great Aqueduct at Cologne, which had once carried water from the Eifel Mountains across nearly 100 kilometers, gradually ceased to function. Sections collapsed. Local populations scavenged its stones for building material. The same story played out across Gaul, Hispania, Italia, and Britannia. By the time of our settlement in 745, the idea of piped water arriving from a distant source would have seemed almost miraculous. The kind of thing preserved in half-understood stories about the old world. What replaced Roman hydraulic engineering was something much older and much simpler. Direct dependence on natural water sources. Archaeological surveys of early medieval settlement patterns across northern Europe reveal an overwhelming correlation between habitation sites and rivers, streams, and springs. The work done at sites like Warendorf in Westphalia, where excavations uncovered a complete early medieval farming settlement, shows houses oriented toward a nearby watercourse, with animal enclosures and field systems arranged around it. The water source was not peripheral to the settlement. It was the axis around which everything else was organized. Similar patterns emerge at dozens of sites across the Frankish heartlands and Anglo-Saxon England. At Yevering in Northumbria, the great royal complex sat in the shadow of the Cheviot Hills near the River Glen, and the placement was no accident. The river provided drinking water, water for livestock, a route for transport, and a source of fish. Remove the river, and the settlement had no reason to exist. Rivers in the 8th century were not simply sources of drinking water. They were arteries of movement, protein, power, and waste management all at once. Consider what a single river meant to a community of perhaps 50 or 80 souls living along its banks. In the morning, water was drawn for drinking and cooking. It was carried to livestock. It was used to soak grain for brewing the thin, slightly sour ale that was the staple drink of much of Northern Europe. Safer to consume than untreated water because the brewing process, though no one understood this in microbial terms, reduced the load of harmful organisms. The Capitulare de Villis, that remarkable administrative document issued under Carolingian authority, specifies in detail the management of royal estates. And among its many concerns is the proper provision of brew houses and the availability of clean water for their operation. Water for brewing was not an afterthought. It was an economic and nutritional priority. Further downstream or at a bend in the river where the current slowed, fish traps might be set. Freshwater fish, particularly eels, bast, were a critical source of protein across early medieval Europe. The Domesday Book, compiled some 3 centuries later but reflecting patterns that stretched deep into the early medieval period, records thousands of eel renders owed by settlements across England, suggesting a vast and ancient infrastructure of riverine fishing. In the Frankish world of the 740s, monastic communities were especially dependent on fish during the many fast days prescribed by the rule of Saint Benedict, now when meat was forbidden. Rivers flowing past monasteries like Corby or Fulda were not simply scenic features. They were pantries, but a river that gave also took. The same watercourse that provided drinking water and fish received the waste of the settlement. Animal dung from byres built close to the water's edge. Human waste from latrines that were often little more than pits or trenches draining toward the nearest slope. Kitchen refuse, lard, tanning effluent in settlements where hides were processed. All of it found its way into the water. Archaeological evidence from sites with preserved organic material, such as waterlogged deposits at York's Coppergate or earlier Frankish settlements along the Rhine, reveals exactly what ended up in early medieval waterways. Parasitic eggs, fragments of decomposing organic matter, traces of metalworking slag, and the general detritus of a community that had no concept of watershed management as we understand it. The woman filling her bucket at dawn was almost certainly drawing water that carried the biological signature of everything happening upstream. And if her settlement was downstream of another community, the situation compounded. The health consequences were significant and largely invisible to the people who suffered them. Intestinal parasites were endemic across early medieval Europe. Ossic, skeletal, and coprolite analysis from sites spanning the Frankish kingdoms to Anglo-Saxon England reveals widespread infestation with roundworm and whipworm, organisms transmitted through fecal contamination of water and soil. These parasites did not typically kill their hosts outright. Instead, they drained them slowly, causing chronic malnutrition, anemia, stunted growth in children, and vulnerability to other infections. The characteristically short stature and signs of nutritional stress visible in early medieval skeletal remains are not solely the result of limited diet. They reflect, in part, a population sharing its caloric intake with parasites acquired from the very water sources on which survival depended. Nobody in 745 understood the mechanism. What they understood was that people were often sick, that children died frequently, and that some seasons brought waves of illness that swept through a community. The connection between water and disease was not yet a concept available to them, though certain monastic writers occasionally noted that stagnant water seemed less wholesome than flowing water, an observation that was empirically sound even without the theoretical framework to explain it. Springs held a special status in this world, and for good reason. A spring emerging from the ground was, in practical terms, often cleaner than river water. It had been filtered through soil and rock. it was less likely to carry the concentrated waste of an upstream settlement. Early medieval communities across Europe show a marked preference for spring sites, and the cultural reverence attached to springs, a reverence that predated Christianity and was absorbed into it, reflects something more than superstition. When Frankish and Anglo-Saxon missionaries encountered pagan populations venerating springs and wells, they did not simply dismiss the practice. They Christianized it. Springs were rededicated to saints. Holy wells proliferated across the landscape, and the tradition of attributing healing properties to certain water sources persisted through the medieval period and beyond. The Council of Tours in 567 and various Carolingian capitularies attempted to regulate or redirect these practices, but the attachment ran deep. People knew, on some intuitive level, that certain water sources were better than others. They wrapped that knowledge in the language of sanctity, because sanctity was the framework they had for understanding why the world worked as it did. The management of water also shaped the emerging power structures of 8th century Europe. Control of a reliable water source was a form of authority. The lord whose estate encompassed the best stretch of river, the abbot whose monastery sat above a productive spring, the king whose palace complex commanded a confluence of waterways. All of these figures derived tangible power from their relationship to water. The Carolingian administrative apparatus, which was in the process of consolidating under the rising power of the Pippinid dynasty in the 740s, paid close attention to the management of water resources on royal estates. Mills, which required flowing water and the engineering skill to harness it, were among the most valuable installations on an early medieval estate. The Capitulare de Villis specifies their maintenance alongside fish ponds, brew houses, and bakeries. A working watermill could grind grain for an entire community, and the lord who controlled the mill controlled a choke point in the food supply. This was not abstract power. It was the power of deciding who ate and who did not. The technology of water management in this period was modest, but not negligible. Wells were dug using techniques that had remained essentially unchanged for millennia. Timber-lined shafts sunk into the water table, sometimes reinforced with wattle or stone where materials allowed. Archaeological excavations at sites across the Rhineland and lowland Britain have uncovered well structures dating to the 7th and 8th centuries that show considerable practical skill, even if they lack the sophistication of Roman engineering. Channels and ditches were cut to drain waterlogged ground or direct flow toward fields and enclosures. Monastic communities, with their relatively large and stable populations and their institutional memory preserved in written rules, were often at the forefront of practical water management. The great monasteries of the Carolingian world, institutions like St. Gall, whose famous plan from the early 9th century shows a sophisticated layout of water channels, fish ponds, and drainage systems, represented the closest thing the early medieval West had to planned water infrastructure. But for the vast majority of people, water management meant walking to the river and carrying it back. It meant knowing which stretch of the stream was best for drinking, which for washing, which for watering animals. It meant understanding, without any written record to consult, the seasonal rhythms of flood and drought, the places where the bank was stable and where it was treacherous, near the times of year when the water ran clear and the times when it turned turbid and dangerous. This was local knowledge, passed from mother to daughter and father to son, and it was as vital to survival as any skill in the early medieval repertoire. The rivers of 8th century Europe are still there. The Rhine, the Seine, the Loire, the Thames, the Weser. They still flow through landscapes that were shaped by the same forces that drew early medieval settlers to their banks. And if you walk along the Lippe in Westphalia, near where Warendorf was excavated, or follow the course of the River Glen past the fields where Yevering's Great Hall once stood, you are walking paths that were worn by people whose entire existence was anchored to the water beside them. The place names survive too. Countless European villages carry names derived from old words for spring, ford, bridge, or well, linguistic fossils recording the moment when someone decided that this spot, beside this water, was the place to build a life. What the people of 745 accomplished with their rivers and springs and timber-lined wells was not glamorous. It was not the soaring achievement of a Roman aqueduct spanning a valley. But it was something arguably more fundamental. It was the patient, unglamorous work of learning to survive without the systems that had once made survival easier. They figured out where the clean water was. They built their homes beside it. They drank from it, and they brewed with it, fished in it, washed in it, and yes, polluted it, because they were human and imperfect, and did not yet understand what they could not see. And from those choices, made by thousands of anonymous people, at thousands of riverbanks, across a fractured continent, the settlement patterns of modern Europe slowly took shape. The next time you notice that your town sits beside a river, or that your street name contains the word well, or spring, or ford, you are hearing an echo of decisions made in the mud and mist of the early medieval world by people who understood, with a clarity born of necessity, that water was life and everything else was negotiable.